The Duke locked her outside in the storm. What he found at dawn left him speechless. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, and by Wednesday, Margaret Cole was standing at the iron gates of Varnmore Estate with a single trunk, a worn leather satchel, and the quiet, steady kind of courage that no one ever sees coming. She was 26 years old. She had never worked in a house like this before. She had taught school in the village of Daleford for 3 years, a small room full of noisy children with muddy boots and sharp minds, and she had loved every chaotic moment of it. But the school had closed when the funding ran dry and there were no positions nearby, and so when the advertisement in the county paper described a governess role at Varnmore, 2 young girls, ages 6 and 8, immediate start, references required, Margaret applied because she had no other choice. She arrived because she had been hired. She did not arrive knowing what she was walking into. The house itself was enormous. Gray stone set against a landscape that was beautiful in the way that silent things are beautiful. The gardens were precise and well kept, but there were no flowers near the main entrance, only trimmed hedges, level gravel, and the kind of quietness that comes not from peace but from discipline. One of the footmen collected her trunk without a word and led her through a side entrance. He did not introduce himself. He did not look at her. She noticed these things the way careful people notice everything, quietly, storing them away. The housekeeper, a tall woman named Mrs. Farrow, met her in the corridor with a set of keys and a long list of rules. Some of the rules were ordinary. Staff did not use the main staircase. Staff ate separately. Visitors were not permitted in the servants' quarters. But some of the rules were unusual in a way Margaret could not quite name at first. The children were to be in bed by 7 o'clock, no exceptions. Noise above a certain level was not permitted in the East Wing. The Duke's schedule was not to be disrupted under any circumstances. Laughter, and this was the rule that made Margaret stop and look up from the paper, laughter in the hallways was discouraged. She asked, as politely as she could, whether that last rule was serious. Mrs. Farrow looked at her with an expression that suggested she had seen other governesses ask the same question, and had seen all of them learn the answer the same way. His Grace, she said carefully, values order. Margaret folded the rule sheet and put it in her pocket. She did not say what she was thinking. As she met the girls that afternoon, Clara was 8, small and watchful, with her father's dark hair and a habit of observing everything before she spoke. Lily was 6, rounder and louder, with a gap in her front teeth and the kind of energy that fills a room before the child herself enters it. They were sitting in the schoolroom on the upper floor when Margaret arrived, both very straight-backed and very still, which was not natural for children of those ages, and which told Margaret everything she needed to know about how they had been living. She sat down on the floor in front of them, which was not what they expected. She asked Clara what she liked to read and Lily what she liked to eat, and within 10 minutes Lily was telling her about a sparrow she had found in the garden with a broken wing, and Clara was explaining, with great seriousness, that she thought sparrows were more interesting than robins because nobody paid them any attention. Margaret agreed completely. By the end of the first hour she had won them both, not because she tried to, but because she was genuinely interested, and children always know the difference. She did not meet Edmund Ashford, the Duke of Varnmore, until the 3rd day. She had heard him, by then, his footsteps in the corridor below, the low rumble of his voice giving instructions to someone, the particular way the whole house seemed to adjust itself when he was present, as if the building itself were paying attention. The staff moved differently when he was near, more quickly, more quietly, with the focused efficiency of people who have learned that being noticed is not always a good thing. She passed him on the main staircase. She had used it by accident, not yet fully memorized which corridors led where, and she nearly walked directly into him. She stepped back. He stopped. He was taller than she expected, with sharp features and the kind of composed expression that sits so firmly on a face it is hard to imagine it ever changing. He was perhaps 35, perhaps a little older. His eyes were gray and entirely direct, and they looked at her with the particular assessment of someone who sorts everything immediately into categories it belongs to. "You are the new governess," he said. It was not a question. "I am," she said. "Margaret Cole, I apologize for the staircase. I will learn the correct route." He studied her for a moment longer than was comfortable. Not in a rude way exactly, in the way of someone who is listening for something beneath the words. Then he said, "See that you do," and walked past her without another word. She stood on the stairs for a moment after he had gone, and then she continued upward, and she thought, that man has been carrying something heavy for a very long time, and he has mistaken the weight of it for strength. She did not say this to anyone, but she did not stop thinking it. The weeks that followed settled into a routine, which was exactly what Edmund Ashford required of his household. Margaret taught the girls in the mornings, geography, reading, arithmetic, and a great deal of drawing. which was not on the approved curriculum but which Margaret introduced anyway because Clara had a genuine gift for it, and Lily had a genuine enthusiasm for it, that deserved to be encouraged. In the afternoons they walked the estate grounds, identified birds, collected interesting stones, and occasionally, when they were far enough from the main house, ran. Running was not on the approved list of activities either. Margaret noted this fact and continued to take them running anyway, because children who cannot run are children being slowly drained of something essential. These small rebellions of hers did not go unnoticed. Edmund Ashford noticed a great many things. He noticed that the girls were noisier at dinner than they had been before Margaret's arrival. He noticed that Clara, who had been obedient to the point of invisibility, had begun to have opinions she expressed aloud. He noticed that Lily, who had been prone to fearful silences, now burst into rooms with an energy she did not bother to contain. He told himself he did not know what to make of this, but what he actually felt, which he did not examine closely, was that the order he had built so carefully around his grief was beginning to shift. His wife, Catherine, had died 2 years earlier, in the winter, from a fever that had come on fast and finished quickly. Edmund had not recovered from this in any visible way, because he did not believe in visible recovery. He had maintained the estate, managed its accounts, attended the obligations of his position, and raised his daughters according to a structure that he told himself was good for them. He had not wept in front of anyone. He had not changed a single thing about the house, including the arrangement of the sitting room where Catherine had spent her last weeks, which was kept exactly as it had been and which no one entered. He was managing. He was entirely certain of this. And then Margaret Cole arrived and the girls started laughing in the hallways, and something in Edmund Ashford's chest tightened in a way he could not explain and chose not to try. He watched her, in the careful sideways manner of a man who does not want to be caught watching. He observed that she was not intimidated by the house. He observed that she spoke to the staff with an ease that dissolved rank, which he found both admirable and irritating. He observed that when she disagreed with something, one of his rules, one of his instructions relayed through Mrs. Farrow, she did not argue, but she did not simply comply either. She found a third way, quiet and deliberate, that achieved what she intended while technically remaining within bounds. It took him 2 weeks to realize she was doing this. When he did, he could not decide whether to be annoyed or impressed, and the indecision irritated him more than either reaction would have. They disagreed about the evening schedule. Margaret had begun reading to the girls after dinner, which extended their bedtime by 40 minutes. Edmund sent word through Mrs. Farrow that the 7 o'clock rule was not a suggestion. Margaret sent word back, politely, through Mrs. Farrow, that she understood, and that she would ensure the reading was finished before 7, which it continued not to be. He could have confronted her directly. He chose not to, because he was not yet ready to stand in a room with her and lose an argument, which some part of him suspected he would. He did stand in the schoolroom doorway one evening, unannounced, and listen from the corridor while she read to the girls. He did not go in. He stood there in the dark hallway and listened to her voice, which was clear and steady and full of the kind of warmth that does not perform itself, and he stayed there far longer than he intended. Clara was asking questions between chapters. Lily had clearly fallen asleep. Margaret was answering Clara's questions with complete seriousness, as if a child's curiosity were the most important thing in the world. He walked away without making a sound. He was not a man who lied to himself often, so when he noticed that the house felt different when Margaret was in it, not better, he told himself, merely different, he acknowledged the observation and put it in a drawer in his mind, and closed the drawer firmly. It stayed closed for exactly 3 more weeks, until the evening of the dinner with Lord and Lady Pemberton. The Pembertons were visiting from London, old family friends, political connections, people of the kind whose goodwill Edmund maintained out of long habit. The dinner was formal, the table set with the full service, the staff instructed on every detail. Edmund had specified through Mrs. Farrow that the children were to take their meal in the schoolroom and were not to be brought downstairs under any circumstances. This was standard for evenings of this kind, Margaret had been told. She had acknowledged the instruction. What happened at 7:15 was therefore, in Edmund's accounting, completely inexcusable. Lily, who had been feverish that afternoon and was therefore restless and unhappy, and not inclined to stay in the schoolroom, had cried until Margaret carried her downstairs, wrapped in a blanket, with the intention of finding Mrs. Farrow, and asking whether there was any fever powder in the medical cabinet. They did not intend to enter the dining room. They did not intend to be seen. But Lily, upon hearing her father's voice through the half-open door, called out for him with the uncomplicated desperation of a sick child who wants its parent, and the door swung further open, and there they were, Margaret holding Lily, Lily flushed and teary, and reaching toward the dining table where Edmund sat at the head with Lord and Lady Pemberton, who turned and looked, and the entire careful architecture of the evening cracked open right down the middle. Edmund stood. His expression did not change, but his eyes moved to Margaret with a coldness that was different from his usual distance. This was not composure. This was anger that had found a direction. He excused himself briefly to his guests, stepped into the corridor, and spoke to her in a voice low enough not to be heard through the wall. He was precise. He was controlled. He told her that she had directly violated an instruction that had been clearly communicated. He told her that her judgment had been irresponsible. He told her that a governess who could not follow simple directives was not a governess this household required. Margaret stood very still, Lily still in her arms, and said quietly that the child had a fever and she had been coming to find Mrs. Farrow, not to disrupt the dinner. He said that the result was the same regardless of the intention. She looked at him, not with anger, but with the kind of steady, clear look that does not accept a dishonest framing, and she said that she understood he was embarrassed, and that she was sorry for the disruption, but that she would do the same thing again, because a sick child needed her parent, and no dinner was more important than that. The silence that followed lasted perhaps 4 seconds. It felt longer. He told her to return the child to the schoolroom and to be ready to receive her final wages by morning. She said nothing more. She turned and carried Lily back toward the stairs. Lily, who had understood almost nothing of what had just passed, pressed her face into Margaret's shoulder and held on tightly, and Margaret held on back, and she did not allow herself to feel the full weight of what had just happened, until she had settled the child into bed with a cool cloth on her forehead. Then she sat in the small chair by the window, in the schoolroom that had become the best part of her days, and she looked out at the sky. There was weather coming. She could see it in the way the clouds had gathered along the western horizon, dark and moving fast, the kind of formation that brought real storms and not just rain. The wind had already picked up. The trees at the edge of the estate were beginning to pull and lean. Mrs. Farrow came at 8:30 with an envelope, her wages as promised, and 3 additional days as settlement. She also came with a second message, delivered in a voice that suggested she did not agree with it, but had no power to refuse it. The Duke had instructed that Margaret was to vacate the premises tonight. She was not to remain in the house. Margaret looked at the envelope. She looked at the window. She looked at Mrs. Farrow, who had the expression of a woman who has worked for difficult people long enough to know that they are not always wrong, and not always right, and that surviving them requires a very particular kind of patience. "Tonight," Margaret said. "Tonight," Mrs. Farrow confirmed. She looked away briefly. "I am sorry." Margaret stood. She did not make any of the arguments that were available to her. She did not point out that there was a storm coming, or that the nearest town was 4 miles away, or that it was nearly 9 o'clock and dark. She took the envelope. She put on her coat. She picked up her leather satchel, because her trunk would have to wait until morning. She walked down the back stairs, past the kitchen where 2 of the younger maids watched her go with wide and horrified eyes, out through the servants' door, and into the night. The wind hit her immediately, cold and insistent, and somewhere in the distance the sky split open with the first crack of thunder. She stood on the gravel path for a moment, letting herself feel the reality of it, the darkness, the rising storm, the closed door behind her, the long road ahead. Then she turned and began to walk, not toward the road, toward the small stone chapel she had noticed on the far edge of the estate grounds during one of her afternoon walks with the girls. It was a 15-minute walk through the dark and the building whined, and by the time she reached it the rain had started in earnest, and her coat was soaked through. The chapel was unlocked. It was always unlocked. She had noted this before, with the same careful attention she brought to everything. Inside it was cold and very small, with 6 wooden pews and a plain altar at the front, and a shelf along the left wall that held 3 candles in iron holders, and a box of matches. She lit all 3 candles. She sat down in the front pew, set her satchel on the seat beside her, and listened to the storm break open above the roof. She did not cry. She did not plan what she would do in the morning, or rehearse arguments she might make, or compose the letter she might write to someone who knew someone who might help her. She did not pray, exactly, though she had grown up in a house that prayed. She simply sat in the candlelight while the thunder rolled and the rain came down in sheets against the old stone, and she let herself be still. Outside, the storm was enormous. Inside the chapel, the 3 small flames stood completely straight. The house was not quiet that night, whatever Edmund Ashford might have wished. He had returned to the dining room and rejoined the Pembertons with the composed efficiency of a man who manages disruptions, and the dinner had proceeded, and Lord Pemberton had told 3 long stories about a hunting trip in Scotland, and Lady Pemberton had admired the silver service, and it had all gone exactly as these evenings were supposed to go. He did not think about Margaret Cole. He focused on the conversation, on the port that followed, on the business of being an attentive host. He did not think about the storm, which had arrived with considerable violence shortly after 10, rattling the windows and sending one of the younger footmen running to secure the shutters on the east side. He did not think about where a woman with a leather satchel and a soaked coat might be in weather like this. He did not sleep until after 2 in the morning. This was not unusual. He often did not sleep until late. It had nothing to do with anything. In the morning, he was up before 5, which was also not unusual. He stood at the window of his study and watched the grounds emerge from the darkness as the sky began, slowly and without enthusiasm, to lighten. The storm had left the gardens in disarray. Broken branches, standing water in the lower paths, the gravel raked into unfamiliar patterns by the wind. He thought about the accounts he needed to review. He thought about a letter he owed his solicitor. He stood at the window and thought about these things and did not think about anything else. At 20 minutes past 5, he put on his outdoor coat and walked the grounds. He told himself this was routine. He often walked in the early morning. It cleared his mind. The fact that his steps took him along the eastern path toward the chapel at the edge of the grounds was simply the result of habit, or the direction of the light, or the fact that the other paths were more waterlogged. He heard nothing as he approached, no sound from within. The door was slightly ajar, which was as he had left it last. The chapel was never locked. He pushed the door open. 3 candle stubs, burned almost entirely down, sat in their iron holders. 2 had gone out. 1 still held a very small flame, wavering slightly in the draft from the open door. And Margaret Cole sat in the front pew, her coat pulled close around her, her satchel on the seat beside her, her back straight and her hands folded in her lap. She was awake. She had the particular stillness of someone who has been awake for a long time and has made their peace with it. She turned her head when he entered, and she looked at him. Her hair was still damp at the edges. There was a small bruise on her wrist from where she had caught herself on the doorframe in the dark, though he would not notice this until later. She was not disheveled, or desperate, or angry. She looked, if anything, like someone who had arrived somewhere and was simply waiting for the next thing. He stood in the doorway. Outside, the sky was turning gray and pale, the first real light beginning to come across the fields. He did not say anything for what felt like a very long time. She did not say anything either. She simply looked at him and waited. Later, he would think about that morning and what he had expected to find in the chapel. He had expected, though he would not have admitted expecting anything, some form of justification for the night, evidence that she had managed, that things had worked out, that his decision had not had the consequences it clearly had. What he had not expected was this: a woman sitting in perfect composure in a stone chapel after a storm, having survived a night that he had sent her into, looking at him as if she were the one with something to teach and he were the student who had not yet opened the book. The last candle went out. The morning light came through the narrow window above the altar. The room was very still. Edmund Ashford, the Duke of Varnmore, who had not said a vulnerable thing aloud in 2 years, opened his mouth, and closed it, and opened it again. He could not find the words. He stood in the doorway of the chapel in the early morning after the storm, and he could not find a single word that was adequate to what he was looking at, or what he had done, or what it meant that she was still here. Margaret Cole waited. She was very good at waiting. The birds had begun to call in the trees outside. The light was growing. The estate was waking up all around them, and neither of them had moved. Edmund Ashford had built his life on the foundation of knowing what to do next. Every morning of his adult life, he had known exactly where to direct himself, what decisions required making, what order things needed to happen in. It was the architecture of a man who had learned early that the world did not accommodate weakness, and that composure was not merely an appearance but a genuine kind of armor. That armor had carried him through his wife's illness, through the grief that had followed it, through 2 years of raising daughters he loved but did not know how to reach. It had carried him through every formal dinner and county obligation and household management difficulty. It had carried him through 3 weeks of Margaret Cole rearranging the small routines of his household in ways he could not quite catch her doing. It did not carry him through the door of that chapel. He had walked those grounds at 5 in the morning telling himself he was walking for the same reason he always walked, the habit of it, the discipline of it. But when he pushed open the chapel door and saw her sitting there, something happened in his chest that he did not have a category for. It was not guilt exactly, though guilt was in it. It was not shame, though there was shame in it too. It was the particular sensation of a man who has believed something firmly about himself, that he is fair, that he is measured, that his decisions are rational, and has walked directly into evidence that none of it is true. He stood in the doorway, she sat in the pew, The last candle went out between them. He said, finally, "How long have you been here?" "Since a little before 9 last night," she said. He looked at the remains of the candles. He did the arithmetic. He said, because he could not say the real thing yet, "You should have gone to the village." "It was 4 miles," she said. "In that storm, I am not foolish. You should have told me you had nowhere to go." She looked at him steadily. "You did not ask," she said, "and I did not feel it was my place to negotiate with a locked door." He did not have anything to say to that. It was, he recognized in some still functioning part of his mind, exactly true. He stepped further into the chapel, because standing half in and half out of it felt cowardly, which it was. He looked at the chapel, the simple walls, the worn pews, the plain altar, as if seeing it for the first time, because he had not really looked at it in years. It had been Catherine's chapel. She had liked coming here early in the morning. He had not been inside it since before she was ill. He sat down, not in the front pew, but in the second row, at an angle so he was not directly behind her. He put his hands on his knees and looked at the altar. "She had a fever," he said. "Lily." "Yes," Margaret said, "a mild one. She was much better by midnight. She slept well." He absorbed this. He said, "You left her in the schoolroom, with the fever." "Clara was with her. Clara is very capable when she needs to be. She knew where Mrs. Farrow's room was if anything changed." A pause. "I would not have left her if I thought she was in any danger." He believed this. He had believed it from the beginning if he was honest, which was the part that had kept him awake until 2 in the morning. He had known, from the moment the anger had moved through him in that corridor, that she had not brought Lily downstairs to embarrass him. He had known her reason was the child. He had dismissed her anyway, because he had been in front of the Pembertons and he had been embarrassed, and because he was not accustomed to being contradicted by anyone in his own house, let alone a governess of 26 who had been with him less than a month. He said, "I was wrong." He said it simply, without preamble, because if he waited any longer for the right moment to say it, he would lose his nerve completely. Margaret was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I know." "I am not accustomed to apologizing," he said, which came out more defensive than he intended. "I can tell," she said, and there was no cruelty in it, just a dry accuracy that was worse than cruelty because it was true. "I sent you out into a storm," he said. "At night, without—" He stopped. He could not finish the sentence without hearing how it sounded, and how it sounded was indefensible. "I did not think about what I was actually doing. I thought about the dinner, about the Pembertons, about the fact that you had done exactly what I had said not to do." "A sick child called for her father," Margaret said. "Yes. And I brought her toward him." "Yes. I would do it again," she said, not as a challenge, as a statement of fact. He looked at her. This woman who had sat in his chapel through a storm. This woman who had been dismissed and locked out and had not gone to the road or raised her voice or written an angry letter. This woman who was sitting here, the morning after all of it, and was telling him calmly that she stood by what she had done. He said, "I know you would." Something shifted in the air between them. Not warmth exactly, not forgiveness yet, but something honest, which was perhaps the more necessary thing. He said, "Why did you stay?" She considered this. He had the sense she was deciding how honest to be, and then deciding to be entirely honest. "The storm was real," she said. "It was not possible to go anywhere safely, but you are asking whether I stayed on the estate rather than leaving at first light." She paused. "Clara and Lily," she said. "I did not want to leave without seeing them. I did not want them to wake up and simply find me gone. That would not be fair to them." She looked at him directly. "They have already lost one person they loved without warning. I was not going to be another one." The words landed in the room and stayed there. Edmund did not respond immediately. He looked at the altar. The morning light through the narrow window was stronger now, pale and even across the stone floor. She had said the thing he could not say. She had named the shape of what had been happening in his house for 2 years, not in accusation, not in pity, but in the matter-of-fact manner of someone who sees clearly and believes the truth deserves to be spoken. He cleared his throat. He said, "I would like you to stay, in the position, if you are willing." She did not answer immediately. This, he recognized, was deliberate. "I have some conditions," she said. Under any other circumstance, from any other person, this would have made him stiffen. He heard himself say, "Go on." "The bedtime rule," she said. "I read to them until the book is finished, or until they fall asleep. I will not end a chapter in the middle, because a clock has reached a number." "Agreed," he said. "They are allowed to run on the grounds. They are allowed to be loud outdoors. Children who cannot run and cannot be loud in the fresh air are children being taught that their natural energy is wrong, and I will not teach them that." He looked at her. She looked back at him. He said, "Agreed." "And I will not be managed through Mrs. Farrow," she said. "If you have instructions for me, or concerns about how I am doing the work, I would ask that you speak to me directly. I am not difficult to talk to. I am simply direct," he said after a moment. "I am aware of that." She studied him. He had the feeling of being read very accurately by someone who had a great deal of practice reading people. Then she said, "All right." She stood. She picked up her satchel. She straightened her coat, which was still damp, but which she wore without apparent complaint. She looked at him where he still sat in the second pew, and there was something in her expression that was not quite pity and not quite understanding, but was somewhere in between, the look of someone who has taken the measure of another person and has decided they are worth the effort. "I will go and see to Clara and Lily," she said. "Clara will have been worrying." He stood as well. This was automatic, the habit of courtesy. He said, "Your trunk. I will have it brought down from the room. It was not. I did not intend." "I know," she said simply. They walked back toward the house together, not quite side by side, along the wet gravel path while the estate came fully awake around them. He did not say anything more. Neither did she. But it was a different kind of silence from the ones that had preceded it. Not the silence of authority and deference. Not the silence of two people avoiding a confrontation. It was the silence of something that had been broken open and had not yet decided what shape it would be in next. At the servants' entrance she stopped and looked at him once more. "Your daughters," she said, "are extraordinary. They are funny and curious and genuinely kind. Clara sees things that most adults miss. Lily loves with her whole heart and does not know how to pretend otherwise." She held his gaze. They needed someone to see that before it got too quiet in them. "I am glad I came." She went inside. Edmund stood on the gravel for a long moment, in the pale morning after the storm, with the birds very loud in the trees around him, and the wet cold air against his face, and he felt something he had not felt in 2 years. He could not quite name it. He was not sure he needed to. He turned and walked back toward the main entrance of the house, and when one of the young maids nearly walked into him in the corridor and gasped an apology and stepped back against the wall, he told her, in a voice that surprised her enough that she later described it to the cook in great detail, that she had done nothing wrong, and should please carry on. The cook said this was the strangest thing she had heard in 2 years of service at Varnmore. She was not wrong. The weeks that followed were not easy. No honest account of them would call them easy. But they were real in a way that the preceding 2 years had not been, and this made them worth something that ease could not have bought. Edmund Ashford was not by nature a man who changed quickly. He had built himself into a particular shape over many years, and the effort of becoming something different was slow and sometimes awkward and occasionally entirely ungraceful. He was aware of this. He found it deeply uncomfortable. He continued anyway, because the alternative, returning to the locked rooms and the silent corridors and the household that held its breath when he walked through it, had become something he could not choose without knowing exactly what he was choosing. He began by removing 3 rules from the household code. The noise restriction was the first to go, which caused such visible relief among the staff that he was briefly mortified by it. The laughter rule was the second. He said nothing when he removed them, just told Mrs. Farrow they were no longer in effect, and asked her to communicate this to the house. Mrs. Farrow said, "Yes, Your Grace," in a tone that he recognized after a moment as suppressed emotion of the positive kind. The third rule he removed was the one about the sitting room. He had the door unlocked and left it open. He did not go inside immediately. He walked past it several times over the course of a week. On the 8th day, he went in and sat in the chair by the window where Catherine had used to sit and read, and he stayed there for an hour, and he let himself feel what he had been not feeling for 2 years. He did not tell anyone about this, but something in his face was different after it, and Margaret noticed, and said nothing, and he was grateful for both things. His relationship with his daughters was the part that required the most patience, from all 3 of them. He had been so thoroughly absent from them, present in the house, present at the dinner table, but absent in every way that mattered, that relearning the vocabulary of their daily lives was genuinely difficult. He did not know what Clara's favorite book was. He did not know that Lily had named the sparrow with the broken wing Percy and visited it in the garden shed every morning. He had to learn these things from the beginning, at 35 years old, and the learning was humbling in the way that only necessary things can be. Clara accepted his renewed attention with the same careful watchfulness she applied to everything. She was cautious with her trust, which he found he could not blame her for, and which he did not rush. He began leaving books on the schoolroom table, books he thought she might like, ones with interesting histories or unusual subjects. She never acknowledged this directly, but the books disappeared, and came back with her careful notes in the margins, and he read her notes with the same attention he would give a letter from an equal. Lily was easier. Lily had not yet learned to protect herself from loving people, and so she simply resumed loving her father with the full force openness she brought to everything, as if no time had been lost. He was not sure he deserved this. He held on to it anyway. Margaret managed all of this with the same practical clarity she brought to everything. She did not direct Edmund, or coach him, or arrange orchestrated moments between him and the girls. She simply continued doing her work with the warmth and rigor she had always brought to it. And she stayed out of the way when the family needed its own space, and she was available when it didn't. She was, he observed, very good at knowing the difference. They spoke more now, he and Margaret, not at length, and not in the way of people who have decided to be friends, but in the way of people who have stopped pretending to be less than they are in each other's presence. She told him one evening in November that his account books were organized in a way that made them harder to use than they needed to be. He asked her how she knew this. She said she had been taught accounting by her father, who had kept records for a mill. He asked if she would be willing to look at the estate records, which surprised him somewhat as he said it. She said she would. She spent 3 afternoons in his study, reviewing a year's worth of accounts, and presented him with a clear and entirely correct analysis of 3 areas where money was being quietly lost through outdated practice. He implemented every change she suggested. He did not make a large thing of this. He simply did it, which was, she had once told him, the correct way to acknowledge when someone is right. Lord Pemberton visited again in December, without Lady Pemberton, for a brief call about a local matter of some county business. He mentioned the dinner, obliquely, the way men of his class mention awkward things, sideways, briefly, with the expectation of a similar sideways response. Edmund said, without evasion, that he had handled the situation poorly and that the governess in question remained in the household. Lord Pemberton looked at him for a moment with something between surprise and respect, and then said that he had always thought children should be allowed to make a bit of noise, and they moved on to county business. Clara drew a picture in January that she left on Edmund's desk without explanation. It was a careful pencil drawing of the chapel, seen from outside, with light visible in the small window, and the storm represented by a series of precise, controlled lines in the sky above it. In one pew, barely sketched, was a small figure sitting very straight. In the doorway, barely sketched, was another figure, taller, standing still. He kept the drawing. He put it in the left-hand drawer of his desk, where he kept the small number of things he valued most, and when he opened that drawer afterward, which was often, he did not pretend not to notice it. Margaret left Varnmore Estate in the spring of the following year, 9 months after the night of the storm. She did not leave abruptly, or in conflict, or because anything had gone wrong. She left because a woman she had corresponded with in the county, the widow of a schoolmaster, who had connections and a small sum of money and a great deal of determination, had written to ask whether Margaret would help her establish a school for working-class girls in the town of Hadwick, 8 miles from the estate. Margaret told Edmund about it on a Tuesday morning, in his study, in the direct manner she used for everything. She had been offered a position she was suited for. She believed it was important work. She intended to take it. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "What do you need?" She looked at him. This was not. She had apparently not expected this. He said it again, more clearly. "The school. What do you need that you don't currently have?" She told him. She told him with the same practical specificity she brought to the account books. The building that was available at what cost, the books that were needed, the small salary that would be required for a second teacher, the things that could wait and the things that could not. He listened to all of it, and when she was finished he said he would provide the funding for the building's first year, and the books and the salary. He said this as a statement, not an offer. She did not tell him to reduce it, or argue that he was being too generous, or soften it with excessive gratitude. She said, "Thank you, I accept." She left on a Wednesday morning in early April, in good weather, with her trunk properly loaded this time, and enough in her pocket to begin. Clara and Lily stood on the front steps, the main steps, the correct steps by his instruction, to say goodbye. Clara did not cry, but her jaw was tight and her eyes were bright. Lily cried completely, without any attempt to stop, and held on for a long time. Edmund shook Margaret's hand at the gate. This was formal, and slightly awkward and entirely inadequate to the occasion, and he was aware of this. He said, "The school will matter. What you build there will matter." She looked at him. She said, "So will this house, if you keep doing what you have started." He did not have anything to add to that. He opened the gate. She walked through it, and turned once, briefly, and then continued toward the road where the hired carriage was waiting. He stood at the gate until the carriage had gone out of sight. Then he walked back up the steps, past Clara and Lily who were still standing there, and he put one arm around Clara's shoulders and held out his other hand for Lily, and the three of them went inside the house together, into the warmth and the sound of it, into whatever came next. Hadwick School for Girls opened in September of that same year with 14 students, 2 teachers, and a supply of books that people in the county said was more than any school of that size had any right to expect. Within 3 years it had 41 students. Within 5 it had expanded to a second building. The girls who attended learned to read with rigor and pleasure, learned figures and geography and history, learned that their questions were worth asking, and that their minds were worth developing, and carried these things with them into lives that opened in ways their mothers' lives had not. Margaret ran the school for 11 years. She was not famous. She was not written about in newspapers or celebrated at county dinners. She was known, in Hadwick and the surrounding villages, as the woman who ran the school, in the same plain way that the baker was known as the baker, and the doctor as the doctor. This was the exact kind of recognition she had always wanted. She visited Varnmoor twice a year, not out of obligation, and not out of sentiment alone, but because Clara and Lily had asked her to, and because she had meant it when she said they were extraordinary, and she wanted to watch them grow. She sat at the same table where she had once eaten separately from the family, and talked with them the way people talk who have genuine interest in each other's lives and genuine respect for each other's minds. Edmund was different, across those years, in the way that real change is always different from performed change, visible in the small things more than the large ones. He knew the names of all his staff. He asked about their families. He had been known to stand in the corridor outside the schoolroom and listen to Clara teaching her younger sister something she had recently learned, and to walk away afterward wearing an expression that people in the house had learned to recognize as his version of happiness. He funded the school's second building without being asked, through a quiet arrangement with the solicitor. Margaret found out about this 3 months after the fact, when the solicitor mentioned it in passing. She wrote Edmund a letter that said, in its entirety, "I know what you did, thank you. The girls in the second building begin their first term next week. They will not know your name, but they will have what it bought them." He kept the letter in the same drawer as the chapel drawing. Clara, at 19, was accepted into a correspondence program at the Women's College in the North, one of the first of its kind, and fiercely competitive. Her father read her acceptance letter 3 times in a row, standing in his study, and then he sat down. He wrote her a letter that she kept for the rest of her life, which said, among other things, that he had not always known how to show her what she meant to him, and that this was his failure and not her inheritance, and that she should take everything she was and put it into the world without waiting for anyone's permission. She wrote back that she had learned most of what she knew about not waiting for permission from a governess who had once carried her feverish sister through a darkened corridor toward a dining room she had no business entering, and that she thought perhaps he owed that woman more than a funded school building. He wrote back that she was almost certainly right. He also wrote that arguing with her was beginning to feel like arguing with someone who had read the same books he had and arrived at better conclusions, which he considered both a source of great pride and a considerable personal inconvenience. Lily, at 17, found Percy the sparrow dead in the garden shed one November morning, and buried him under the elm tree at the edge of the east garden with a small stone marker on which she had carefully inscribed his name and the years of his life, insofar as they could be estimated. She asked her father to stand with her for the burial, and he did, hat in hand, in the cold November air, with the seriousness the occasion deserved. He did not make any remark that suggested this was a small thing. He stood beside her, and when she cried briefly, he did not tell her not to. Later she told Margaret about it in a letter, and Margaret wrote back that a father who buries a sparrow seriously beside his daughter has understood something important, and that Lily should remember this. Edmund Ashford lived to be 71 years old. He was not remembered as a great man in the public sense. He held no important office, made no grand speeches, left no political legacy. He was remembered, in the county, as a man who had managed his estate fairly and treated people decently, which is not nothing. He was remembered by his daughters as the man who had tried, imperfectly and late and sometimes with visible difficulty, to become what they needed him to be, and who had kept trying long after the trying became habit and then simply became who he was. He was remembered by the people who knew the full story, very few, because he never told it, and she told it only once, in a letter to her oldest friend, as the man who had locked a governess out in a storm and stood in a chapel doorway the next morning unable to speak, because what he found there had broken something in him that needed to be broken. Margaret Cole did not retire. She continued to teach, in one form or another, until her hands no longer cooperated with writing on blackboards, and then she taught by talking, which she had always been better at anyway. She outlived Edmund by 12 years. She attended his funeral with Clara and Lily, and she sat in the front pew of the village church, not the small estate chapel, though she thought about it. And she did not cry, which some people found surprising. Those who knew her better understood. She had made her peace with him many years before. There was nothing left to grieve that had not already been given its proper weight. There is a photograph, taken in the summer of Edmund's 65th year, on the occasion of Lily's wedding at the estate. It shows a long table in the garden, full of people, bright in the afternoon light. At the center of the table, Edmund sits with Lily on his left and Clara on his right. At the far end of the table, slightly apart, in the shade of the elm tree under which a small stone marker still reads Percy, Margaret Cole sits with a glass in her hand and is clearly in the middle of telling someone something that is making them laugh very hard. She is not looking at the camera. She rarely looked at cameras, but if you know where to look in the photograph, and if you look closely, you can see that Edmund, at the center of the table, is looking at her. Not in any significant way. Not with anything that could be labeled. Just looking, the way a man looks at something that changed the shape of his life. With the ordinary and permanent gratitude of someone who knows exactly how different things might have been. The storm had been real. The locked door had been real. The long night in the cold chapel had been real. Every hour of it. And the morning that followed had been real too. The gray light coming through the narrow window, the last candle going out, a man standing in a doorway unable to find a single word, and a woman waiting, in the patient and undefeated way she had always done everything, for him to find one. He found one. It took a while, but he found one. That is where the story begins. Everything else is what they built from it.